Hey everyone, Elia here, and welcome to another episode of the Fire These Times. Today we're starting with a new format, one which I hope to do more of. As some of you may know, one of my passions is history, and this episode is a good example, I think, of why that is. Guest host Abdulla Moaswes, a Palestinian scholar and old buddy of mine, is joined by two scholars of Kashmir, Ather Zia and Hafsa Kanjwal, who will introduce themselves in a bit, of course, to talk about, well, Kashmir. It's a long episode, but that's because we wanted to make sure to present Kashmir's history on its own terms, a Kashmir perspective, if you want, that does not center Pakistan and certainly not India, or China for that matter. If you're listening to this on the public feeds, please know that you can already listen to the full episode on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. For as little as $5 a month, you will get access to the entire archive of the From the Periphery Media Collective podcast, including, of course, the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, the From the Periphery podcast, the Mutual Aid podcast, as well as our newly released podcast, Khida, Jewish Counter-Colonial Thoughts, and The Inconvenient Revolution, our podcast on Syria. These are all publicly available. You can search for them on your podcast app right now. But by joining the Patreon, you not only support our projects, which will also soon include a zine, by the way, but you will also occasionally get early access to full episodes like this one. One more thing before starting the episode properly. We are keen on getting audience feedback to better understand what we need to prioritize. If, for example, you would like for there to be more episodes on Kashmir, the best way to do so is by connecting with us via our Patreon. By doing so, you would be able to suggest topics on virtually anything, as well as guests, of course, in addition to the perks that I already mentioned. Okay, so here's the episode. For much of the last 3 decades, Kashmir has been among the most militarized places on Earth, with its territory divided between 3 nuclear-armed states of India, Pakistan, and China. Earlier this year, events in the region acted as a prelude to an armed confrontation between India and Pakistan, which the former used as an opportunity to deeply entrench an emergent settler-colonial form of rule in the territory. Many view the Kashmir question as simply a territorial dispute between these 3 states. But as this podcast series will demonstrate, the Kashmir question is one about colonial occupation and anti-colonial resistance. In this podcast series, Hafsa, Ather, and Abdulla first outline the origins of the Kashmir crisis, explaining how the region came to be partitioned as a result of British and Indian colonialism. They contextualise Kashmir's colonisation within the project of Indian statebuilding, as well as the territory's relevance to regional geopolitics. In part 2, they discuss Kashmiri resistance over the decades, including the events that led to and comprised the Kashmir Intifada that broke out in the late 1980s. The third and final episode consists of an assessment of Kashmir's current status, and the guests will present us their outlook for the future. So, that's all from me, folks. Here is the episode. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think a really interesting piece as well to read on the question of the pundits and their return is a piece by Munabhan and Deepti Misri that was, I think, published in Al Jazeera that kind of talks about the way in which the narrativization of this return kind of forecloses the possibility of there being a relationship between Kashmiri pundits and Kashmiri Muslims that resembles that which had existed in the past. And coupled with the in the years before Article 370 was revoked, I recall reading as well of these Indian government ministers who would talk about the possibility of building these colonies, they called them, that would be protected by the Indian army in Kashmir for pundits specifically, which in a sense kind of almost changes the political configuration, right? That sort of sounds to me like the introduction of a settler colony, ironically using the bodies of people who are indigenous. But it's that sort of like political, or rather even spatial configuration, that sounds like settler colonialism. And once Article 370 gets revoked in 2019, in August of 2019, I guess during the Amarnath Yatra, when all of the pilgrims who go to this very politicized pilgrimage in any case are evacuated, and then there's a communications blockade imposed, we also start to see the introduction of that phrase of or the framework of settler colonialism being used very frequently in reference to Kashmir. There's a great piece as well by Samreen Mushtaq and Mudassir Amin that talks about kind of like historicizing that framework in Kashmir and like thinking back to the fact that actually the like Kashmiri political leaders involved in resistance had for a long time talked about the probability that there will be an attempt at a demographic shift, even during the period of Article 370, where the laws made that a little bit more complicated. But I think I just wanted to ask kind of two very connected questions, one a theoretical one and one kind of an empirical one, of since we are kind of like going through almost like a chronological explainer of the situation in Kashmir, to kind of simultaneously talk about the 2019 moment and the revocation of Article 370, how that happened and what was its significance in that particular moment. And of course, kind of like the developments that led to this. And I'm thinking in my mind as well of like the 2019, February 2019 attack in Pulwama and the way that that was used electorally by the BJP, and the statements of government ministers and I think the former governor of Kashmir after that as well. And then also alongside that, kind of like a theoretical mention of the use of the settler colonial framework in Kashmir, and what that enables as well, and kind of like the theoretical turn that that created.
2019 is not a it's not a rupture between what's before and what's after, because I think that's one danger that Kashmiris see in this, that it's something that BJP is doing to them. As we earlier said, that it's kind of a continuity, it's a progression of what was taught in 1947 and how Kashmir is going to be forcibly assimilated and finally kind of quote unquote integrated. Integration is a very soft word, but for Kashmir, it's very violent. So the moment of 2019 really comes after all the mix of torture, mass incarcerations, and crackdowns, curfews that people have been undergoing for the last 20, 25 years. So what happens in that moment is that there is this brutal escalation of military aggression. They fly in more 70,000 troops or something and place the region under siege. And there's a communication lockdown, which from August 2019 kind of segues into the COVID lockdown. So people don't know the difference between one and the other. So they don't have communications, they don't have internet, they don't have phones. International media was banned. We were all here, but our families, we didn't know what was happening to them. So there was this black hole of communication that happened. No one knew what was underway. It did come to light every now and then, and during that time, it became a humanitarian crisis because people did not have medical facilities were not available to them. People were dying inside their homes, and that's all of that is so undocumented. We have anecdotal evidence of relatives and friends whose elderly and sometimes young people, they died during that time, and one of them had to be buried in her backyard because there was no one around. It's important to mention that Genocide Watch put an alert on the region. That also goes on to show the level of worry and anxiety that people transnationally had about what India can do, because there was this precedence and history which is completely glossed over by India and its sympathizers and allies. So in the last 5 years, now there are new laws that are entrenching dispossession. There is new forms of imprisonment happening, not just of the person who is involved, but the entire family. That's criminalizing dissent. And just to go back to, as you were saying, the settler colonial narrative that began to grow bigger. It was a de facto in occupation till then, but then, as many jurists and lawyers, they talked about it being a de jure occupation and putting settler colonialism on steroids, which was already there because the infrastructure had already been enabled and established in 1947 itself. When we talk about the military has always been inside. It has been on the borders, but then it also has been in different places inside Kashmir. I think it's the size of Dallas. That's the level of that's the size of territory that it occupies and has continued to occupy. And now it can declare any place as strategic and take it over, even if it's your home. Even if it's something that it's a children's park, but if the military declares it as strategic, it used to happen before too, but now they don't have to ask any permission from anyone. So just to kind of go back to the theoretical aspect, the structure of invasion that Patrick Wolf talks about, that structure of invasion, we can see that India established in 1947, and it has grown under various guises. I personally, in some of my work, I describe this as that the settler colonial framework, it has this iterative temporal dynamic, which is a mechanism that it evolves and adapts over time. And it also enmeshes native peoples, like we saw in the history that we've talked about, to enable its own establishment, and then it changes, and then it dilutes, and it eliminates, and slowly and steadily it replaces the indigenous population to secure settler control. I think that's where we are in this moment. It does have resonances in European settler colonialism that evolved in context of Palestine and also Turtle Island. So that's a similar structural progression can be seen inside in Kashmir. I'm not saying it's the same, but it is similar because it does derive from the same histories and same from same structure. I'm not saying that India has carte blanche on settler colonialism. Sorry, Europe has carte blanche on settler colonialism, but India has kind of taken this spin-off that is prevalent. And we also must keep in mind the historical particularities and also problematize India's own status as a post-colonial democracy and what that means, and how we must recognize the military occupation and settler colonialism that are enabled and enacted under that status that it has as a post-colonial democracy. In that sense, the post-coloniality and democracy, they were till very recently, and now people have risen to better understandings that post-coloniality and democracy, they were seen as India's hallmarks. But these are the tools that they have used against Kashmiris. Otherwise, Kashmiri resistance really mirrors the subcontinent's own anti-colonial struggle against the British. So that's how we see, or how I particularly see, and I know that my colleagues and my friends who are working on the same framework, because that's how we are seeing it. That's how we see it evolve, and that's how we see it established. And in this moment, they are able to pull off completely silencing Kashmiris as they are in this mode of deep cultural, economic, and political invasion. Elimination rather than invasion.
Yeah, to maybe add to that, both 2019 and also this theory of settler colonialism, one of the important things that is really imperative to mention is that since 2019, the space for any kind of political dissent, any kind of documentation, any kind of journalism, what was already like criminalized in Kashmir before 2019 has just really eliminated. I don't think I can even like fully encapsulate how India has silenced people using a few people, whether they were journalists or human rights defenders, as examples by arresting them under terrorism charges, conducting like regular raids into people's homes, questioning interrogations, even just with this recent war, like if anyone said anything that like that questioned the Indian state's narratives about what was happening, they were called in, they were questioned, their their laptops, phones taken, and much of this we don't hear about. We only hear about it in like silenced whispers in some senses, because people are just too scared to talk about it, because again they don't want to face state reprisal. And so, like, the atmosphere, the level of self-censorship, both within Kashmir, but also amongst the Kashmiri diaspora, because India's tactics are very transnational. It will use your family members in Kashmir. It will use other threats. It will restrict your mobility in and out of Kashmir. And so that keeps a lot of people, like silenced. It works, unfortunately. But of course, still we find different ways to raise our voice or to express what's going on, but it's definitely been made infinitely more difficult in recent years. And so we don't necessarily know the full extent to like what has India achieved in the past 5 years or so, aside from just like, making people self-censor. But we do know that, for example, with these domicile certificates where the category of permanent resident has been removed. And so Indians can now come in, live in Kashmir for a certain amount of time or study there. and then become domicile, which means that they would have access to voting in the region, buying land. Buying land and buying property they can already do, but getting government employment and so on and so forth, which they previously were not able to do. And so a few weeks before or days before the attack, the Pahalgam attack, one of the news stories that had come out was that at least 80,000 domicile certificates had been granted just in the past 2 or 3 years alone to non-Kashmiris. And so the numbers, of course, can be more, and the Indian government is like not necessarily revealing how much land it has grabbed or how many domicile certificates have been granted, because most likely it would create a panic. But there's just been different attempts to like take land. For example, a couple years ago, there was like huge tracts of land in Kashmir that was basically put on a list. And the state basically said that these lands have been encroached upon by the people. And so they're just going to be made into state land or taken over. Um, a little bit of that happened, but there was actually a strong response within Kashmir to that. And so I think they had to stop, but they just keep finding different ways to try to grab land for their, tourism projects or their infrastructural development, their roads, their railroads, etc., displacing people from their farmland, from their orchards, from their homes. So we've seen all of that, but I guess what I want to say is that like the complete picture, like already what's at the surface is so frightening, and then to know that there's probably more that's happening, but we just aren't hearing about it, or it hasn't been documented. It just gives you a sense of like how we should be alarmed. Um, and then with the main thing to say about the settler colonial framework, like Ather mentioned, I mean, it doesn't happen in the exact way in all different places, right? And it also like adapts, settler colonial rule adapts given a number of things, including like the international community and how it's responding, given other actors that are at play, and also given local resistance efforts. And one of the things that we also often hear is a lot of pushback, especially from Indian scholars who may be pro-Palestine and maybe like, definitely are like fully aligned with the liberation of Palestine, but absolutely refuse to see Kashmir and India's relationship with Kashmir as being settler colonial in nature. And so they'll put up like a lot of different like kind of like, I guess like red herring examples of like, oh, but there were Hindus that were present in Kashmir, and so how can it be settler colonial? That's like a deliberate obfuscation of what settler colonial rule is. It doesn't mean that you're like completely denying that a group can be indigenous to a region, but it's like how that power dynamic or how those power relations play out. They say things like, well, Kashmir had its autonomy, and so how can it be settler colonial if non-Kashmiris weren't able to buy land? But as we've kind of already shown, like that was not India's plan. I think India would have moved much quicker in trying to fully incorporate Kashmir had it not been for the UN resolutions, the internationalization of the issue, Kashmiri resistance, as well as the fact that Pakistan was another important player in this game. And so, part of what I also look at in my work is how assimilation, in many ways, which the Indian government also has attempted in Kashmir, to try to erase the people of their sense of history, bring them into line with the Indian settler state, erase especially like the Muslim history of the region. All of those have been tactics that have been used since 1947 as well. And so, so there's different elements of this broader theoretical framework that are at play. And just because something is not happening exactly like it happened in the Americas or in Palestine doesn't deny it altogether. And that's something that we've really been trying to articulate to people who are very skeptical about the use of this framework in the context of Kashmir.
Yeah, totally agree with that. That it doesn't happen exactly in the same manner. It's the structural progression, and people, the specificities of geography and regions and the histories. They all matter. But what is happening inside Kashmir has the hallmarks of this Indian expansionist desire of Akhand Bharat. On that note, I also wanted to talk about the memory side that has been that has been imposed. Uh, the listeners might find it very Interesting to note that the Dogra monarch, who is seen as the despot by Kashmiris, now we have to celebrate his birthday as a holiday. And the Martyrs' Day, which was 13th July 1931, when 22 people were executed by the same monarch, that holiday has been erased completely. You don't have that holiday from the government, nor can people go to the graveyard where they would pay their respects. People might go privately, but there's no delegation, there's no one in official capacity that is able to do that. So the local administration, which was recently elected, they kind of made a small noise about it, but that died down. So that's kind of the level of memory side that has been put into motion through the rubric of occupation as well as the settler colonial policies.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that leads us really well onto kind of like the recent escalations that have taken place, especially since you've both mentioned the Pahalgam attack. And I think in reference to that, I want to kind of ask, how do Kashmiris see this escalation, that's taken place now between India and Pakistan? And how do they see the Pahalgam attack as well? Because from my understanding, it doesn't resemble the sort of modus operandi that Kashmiri resistance has previously used. And so I think that's sort of like the one side of this question. And then the other side as well is in addition to how do Kashmiris see it and understand what's been going on between India and Pakistan recently, that has been effectively a fight over the bodies of Kashmiris. Sorry, I'm losing my words here a little bit. But what does it also signal, I guess, in terms of like precedents for the future? In the sense that, I mean, one of the things that India has done is to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty, which is a treaty that has been in place since 1960 and that has survived, several, escalations and aggressions between India and Pakistan. And its suspension, I think, is a really interesting precedent. And so I guess, again, it's a little unfair of me to put these questions together, but I think it gives us a little bit of an opportunity to give a good explanation of what's been going on recently, both kind of from the perspective of international politics, but also from the perspective of Kashmiris who are witnessing all of this.
What you talked about India suspending the water sharing agreement, the Indus Water Treaty. They also expelled diplomats. They also revoked Pakistan visitors' visas. Even the women that were married to Indians, and many of them are Muslim, and many of them are also in Kashmir, who were the wives of ex-militants who were given general amnesty in 2010. And then they also closed the borders. What Pakistan ended up doing was they rejected the accusations because there was this pretext that this attack was fueled by Pakistan, and then they're using Kashmiris as proxy. Interestingly, what Pakistan did was it suspended the 1971 Shimla Agreement by also closing trade and airspace. So that is very interesting for Kashmiris because Shimla Agreement is the agreement which was done in 1971 between the two nations where they had the exchange of prisoners of war, but also they downgraded Kashmir into a bilateral dispute. Now, what that means in this moment is not fully graspable, but it certainly is a very important occurrence in the psyche and I feel like in the witness of Kashmiris who have seen this as some sort of a betrayal from the Pakistani dispensation. So we don't know what exactly is going to happen, but that has been a very important pointer to some kind of geopolitics that might be unfolding very soon.
Yeah, I guess for me, again, it's been very difficult to know what Kashmiris are thinking about this because even when they speak, we have to bear in mind that, like, this is, again, one of the most repressive periods in Kashmir's recent history. And so we have to also, like, think about how they're speaking and what they're saying, knowing that, keeping that in mind, especially given that immediately within, like, minutes after the attack, there were already calls on social media and among some Indian commentators to turn Kashmir into Gaza, which we've heard before as well as a possible solution to this whole, problem of Kashmiri Muslims and so on, and the liberation struggle. But that kind of keeping that like open, I think also like who did Pahalgam or how what exactly happened there will be an open question. It's something that many of us are asking ourselves. We know there's a history of Indian state-led kind of what it's called false flag attacks. But we also know that, this narrative of normalization that the Indian state had been trying to push is being ruptured massively in this moment. And it's very embarrassing for Modi and his leadership and the Indian government, what has happened. So I think those two questions are kind of open for me. But I think two things that have come out of this, like and one is thinking about it just through the prism of like the India Pakistan and like broader geopolitics, is that India's regional ambitions, many of us were very nervous that they are obviously super belligerent and they're bully, and have like a very heightened sense of self and see themselves as a superpower or intend to be a superpower. And that has kind of been kept at bay, given the Pakistani state's response, obviously with these Chinese weapons. And so I don't know how India will respond to that. I think they expected that the United States would be, especially Trump, would be like fully in support. And he did not do what they would have hoped for. And instead, he actually brought up the K word, right? He brought up Kashmir and he said that, I'm going to help these guys resolve it, which totally like made Indian commentators like foam at the mouth. Like, how dare he say that this is a dispute? Like, this is an integral part of India. So there's that interesting thing that's happening. But I think within Kashmir, I mean, like we mentioned earlier, Kashmiris are always the ones who have to suffer when there's India-Pakistan fighting, shelling, especially those who live on the line of control. This time, a lot of people in Azad Kashmir also were killed as a result of those strikes as well, Indian strikes. And so I think people there also, especially in Indian occupied Kashmir, face the brunt of the Indian state's embarrassment. I mean, for sure, we know that like thousands of people have been picked up and interrogated in the past few weeks. And it's, like the repression, like the embarrassment that they kind of faced on the world stage, they will take it out on Kashmiris themselves. And yet there is something to be said for like um, this. I'm sure, even though I haven't been able to talk to people freely, I'm sure there must be some kind of relief and perhaps feeling of hope after a very, very long time, that this entity that has been like suppressing people's voices hasn't allowed them to utter any bit of dissent, has basically been, expanding its settler colonial project, has kind of been shown its true face in many ways. A lot of people are talking about the kind of crazy genocidal commentary that you saw in the Indian media and on Indian social media. People knew, of course, that elements of that had existed, but now it's much harder for Indians, including Indian leftists and liberals, to hide that reality. So I think it's actually a really interesting and important moment, to have these conversations and to think through some of these like transnational connections as well as the impact or the ramifications for geopolitics broadly.
Yeah, just to reiterate that India is really in this moment increasingly frustrated with the rehyphenation that they are calling it in their media and the discussions they're having. It's almost like as if it's beneath them to be connected to as India and Pakistan over the Kashmir question, which has been really brought bang into the center again. And then the other thing that I also wanted to reiterate what Hafsa has already said is that it's the Kashmiris who do the dying in all of this, and that's kind of like that's their lot. That and also trying to get rations together for however long this crisis might last. So it is between the two, the dying and trying to survive, that they have lived most of their 77 years. And then the other side was that as there was this tension and killings happening of Kashmiris, there were contesting and jubilatory meme war happening between India and Pakistani social media. But one of the things that we also must remember in this moment is that this military crisis was not about losing or winning, but it was also about new strategy and narrative that is being put into place, I feel. Pakistan has defended itself diplomatically as well as militarily. It has refused India's attempt to make this about strategic dominance and its Akhand Bharat desires. But on the other hand, India is so bold as to put into motion an Israel-like strategy, challenging sovereignty norms, just going into neighbor's border, and there's no global repercussions on that, at least. No one has reprimanded it. So that's something that is kind of the new norm in the subcontinent. And I know the problem in this moment is that I feel that there is a growing danger of bypassing Kashmiris in this dispute, because it's going to become about securitization of Kashmiri population. It's going to become about the nuclear anxieties that the world has. And then it's going to become about the nation states. And we will once again fail to address what the genuine issue is. So I think that needs to be forefronted as this might kind of increase as the conversations around this are increasing or decreasing. We don't know how it's going to go, but at the moment it does look like there is enough conversation, and Kashmiris have always been they have been the stakeholders, but they've always been pushed to sidelines. And I see that danger in this moment as well if we don't keep the focus on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, there's still so much more that we could have addressed. I mean, just very quickly on the issue of precedents. I mean, what you just said, Athar, reminds me of in 2008, after the attack in Bombay, the police commissioner at the time, I recall, also saying something along the lines of, "Oh, international community has regarded India as a soft state, and actually we should be more like Israel in the sense that we just go out, kill the people we need to kill, and then, just come back, and nobody should address us for that. No one should talk to us about it." So I think it's very interesting, nearly a decade and a half later, seeing that manifestation. Sorry, were you gonna say something?
No. I was just agreeing with you that the bar has been
Okay.
set so low that the next time political analysts in the region, they're saying, what if, because these are guerrilla groups, the militant outfits, anyone can do anything. So does that mean that India is going to go into a full-blown airstrike into a sovereign territory and kill people and come back and cause damage, and no one is going to ask it any questions? And we are witness to the fact that no one has really reprimanded uh, India. And what Pakistan did was in its defense. And there was this pretext, and the precedents became permanence for some reason.
hmm Yeah, I think, like in that sense, it does represent like a really worrying moment, as you both really skillfully articulated. There are two kind of like connected questions that I just like us to end on, and I think in the spirit of having like a revolutionary conviction in our victory as colonized peoples. The first of these is, what do you think that global struggles for liberation can learn from the Kashmir case and from Kashmiri resistance? And then kind of connected to that, what does Kashmiri liberation look like to you?
I want to be hopeful in this moment. I wasn't so hopeful some months ago. Perhaps my response would be a bit more despondent, but I think part of what I've been thinking about is that things that you may conceive as inevitable, um, especially given that nobody seemed to have been paying attention to Kashmir before this past month, and India had really kind of succeeded in not that people actually believe that things were normal, but it just there's not enough of a political will to focus on Kashmir and to resolve this issue. And there's obviously the different world powers are focusing on different regions, etc. And so I think many of us did feel really, really despondent and isolated and so on. But I think even though I don't know what Kashmiri liberation looks like in a moment where so many of our pro-freedom leaders have been assassinated, have been jailed, have been killed, are under house arrest, etc. And so it's really hard to mobilize. I think part of what I've learned is that anything can happen, and truly anything can happen. And within the time period that I studied, the 1950s and the 60s, again, there was this projection of normalcy, development, progress. And then right after that, there was an incident that happened, which basically caused people to come out to the streets again and demand the plebiscite or demand self-determination. And so there is something about this like cyclical nature of resistance. And I guess part of what gives me hope is that where there is repression, and occupation and colonization, there is always going to be resistance. And it may ebb and flow, and it may not be so visible. It may be forcibly kind of invisibilized, but it exists. And we just have to prepare for it. Like sometimes I question myself. I'm like, why am I, it felt like I was, like many of us perhaps felt like we were talking into a void, especially when our voices can't be supplemented by people on the ground in Kashmir because they have been silenced. So sometimes you feel like, am I making any sense? Like, what am I saying? And so you just have to kind of keep going and know that the work that you're doing, the analysis that you're providing is important. It's in solidarity, not just with your people, but also with many other colonized peoples around the world. And so I think that's one thing I don't know if, we can learn from Kashmir, is that anything can happen, anything can change things, and you just have to be ready when that time comes.
So just to build on what I feel all of the I second what Hafsa has already said. I just wanna say that I do think situations and sites and problems that are kind of portrayed as intractable, as if these are conflicts and there is nothing of a resolution, of a proper resolution that can be given to them except to kowtow to what the bigger hegemonic powers are saying. So I think this moment where we see indigenous peoples coming together in different iterations, whether that be in activist circles, academic circles, whether that be in policy groups, and just on social media, talking together and connecting these oppressions, I think this time is really opportune for us to think about alternatives that can be the realities for situations such as Kashmir. And Kashmir is also, it gives you a very creative understanding of what a future might look like, a future that is not bound the way nation states and the security paradigm sees it. So I think in this moment, we have to think about there is an imperative that Kashmir is about political resolution, but it's also about decolonization. It's about demilitarization. It's about dismantling of settler infrastructures and these imperial modes of governance that have become so normal that no one questions them. So I feel that the disarmament that needs to happen, it's material, it's epistemic, and it's also in this moment, this vision is really foreclosed by the violence of this capitalist nation state that's kind of imposing this mall development, this ecocidal modernity. But I think what decolonial indigenous scholars from and activists and people in all these places, from Palestine to Turtle Island, teach us that there are ways and means to fight and to look for alternate visions that are not as brutal and as tyrannical. But that look towards people's interdependence, their cooperations, their love for each other. And I think Kashmir is that kind of a place where people for the longest possible time have seen themselves as distinct, which is why you see our worst collaborators are also kind of, identitarian and nationalistic in some ways. So that's kind of the irony. And I think this is that moment of asking for what is seen as impossible, but is not that impossible to ask for the dismantling of these infrastructures and these imperial modes of governance.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was a great note to end on. Thank you so much. It's been great to hear from you both and to learn from you both. Both of you, of course, people whose work that I've been reading for many years, and it's lovely to sit and discuss this topic with the two of you. And thanks as well to Ilya for providing us the platform. I think there are still a lot of things that we could have gone into, I think, in a lot more depth, but I think in many ways we've touched upon a lot of kind of like the key things people need to know to kind of begin learning about Kashmir. And for that, I'm immensely grateful. I hope this is the start of maybe a longer conversation that we can have on these sort of more specific points that we could have gone into but didn't. And so thank you so much again from myself, and thank you to Ilya as well for providing the platform. And I guess we can end there.
Thank you, Ilya, Abdullah, and Hafsa, because it's such a it's only now we are getting our story right. That's what I think. In the last 2-3 decades, Kashmiris are piecing together their story, which we didn't have. It was really odd for all of us to grow without a story, except for what India was telling us. So thank you for making us do this.
Thank you both for this, honestly, and Abdullah as well. This was a very fascinatingly and enriching conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
You've listened to the third and final part of the Kashmir Question, a limited series by the Fire These Times, part of the From the Periphery Media Collective. You can listen to the full episode on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. That is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. If you'd like to see more episodes such as this one, including more episodes on Kashmir, please let us know on the same Patreon link. As always, thank you for listening and take care.